Hello, my name is Sharon Peterson, and I'm one of the registered dietitian nutritionists who work at the Villages Health. And today I'd like to talk to you about a topic that I've been studying for over 10 years and I'm very passionate about. And the title of this topic is Muffin Tops, Sugar Bellies, and Chronic Inflammation. So what I want to talk about today is go over the importance of the basic inflammation process. Then I want to transition into talking about how does this basic inflammation process become chronic inflammation throughout the whole body. Is chronic inflammation related to obesity? And is it possible to reverse chronic inflammation? So what is inflammation? What is this basic inflammation process? Well, as you can see here in this picture, here's a father helping the son put Band-Aids on his knee. Okay, so that makes us think of this normal and important part of our body's defense system. We need to have inflammatory response to be able to ward off infections and toxins and foreign substances. It's meant to be a short-term sound the alarm kind of a process. And the classic symptoms, I'm sure we've all experienced some of these, if not all: redness, swelling, heat, pain. So that's the basic inflammation process, and we need it to be able to walk around without having to live in a sterile environment our whole lives. So then what is chronic inflammation? This is when our immune system is in a chronic state of alarm. It continues to perceive toxins and foreign substances, and it doesn't ever stop. And so it shifts into this chronic state of alarm, which eventually over time develops into whole body chronic inflammation. So chronic inflammation could be thought of like a smoldering fire, and it is now being viewed as associated with increased risk for many, if not most, of our autoimmune diseases and our chronic diseases. So let me share a quote from a book called Ultra Metabolism by Dr. Mark Hyman. This book is the first one that got my attention about this idea of chronic inflammation. So his quote says, inflammation, meaning chronic inflammation, is connected to every major health condition we face today. It is in large part responsible for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, arthritis, allergies, and autoimmune diseases. So I'm just going to let that sit and sink in for a minute, because we used to have all of these diseases, we sort of viewed them in separate boxes. And now, if we see that chronic inflammation is, the grandparent of all of these diseases, now we see that they're much more related than we ever used to understand. So chronic inflammation is at the core of all of our chronic diseases and autoimmune disorders. Here's some more diseases that have been linked to chronic inflammation that weren't listed in that quote I just read. So RA, MS, celiac, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's, lupus, myasthenia gravis, sinus problems, asthma, decreased immune function, IBS, GERD, psoriasis, insulin resistance, type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, dementia, obesity, and even the basic aging process itself. So that begs the question, what causes chronic inflammation? I'm going to count down from 5 to 1. So the top 5 causes of chronic inflammation. Number 5 is food intolerances. So especially gluten, dairy, eggs, soy, and peanuts. But if someone has a food intolerance, that causes chronic inflammation in the body. Environmental toxins and infections, that kind of makes sense because that's what we're trying to fight off, right, with our basic inflammation process. Lack of physical activity is very inflammatory to the body. Stressful lifestyle and poor sleep, again, very inflammatory to the body. And I'm wondering if anyone can guess what the number 1 cause of chronic inflammation is. It is actually the standard American diet, which we like to call SAD. So it is this idea of ultra-processed, high sugar, high saturated fat, high salt, empty calorie junk foods. Here's some ideas and pictures in case we're still confused. So cookies, chips, donuts, pastries, snack cakes, fast food, soda, candy, all very inflammatory to the body. The body views these ultra-processed junk foods as a foreign substance and actually releases an inflammatory response. So how then is inflammation related to obesity? Another quote from that book. In the U.S., we have an abundance of convenient, cheap, poor quality foods that lack nutrients and are high in sugar, refined carbs, and saturated fats. So here's the key. Those poor quality, ultra-processed junk foods cause the cells to get out of balance and stressed and triggers an inflammatory message, like I said, as if it's a toxin or a foreign substance. So this idea of sounding the alarm. How is inflammation related to obesity? Because we're choosing to put these poor quality, ultra-processed junk foods into our bodies. So it turns out the fat cells in the midsection produce these stress hormones and inflammatory messages. And that's a cartoon of a fat cell. They take their jobs very seriously. All the normal parts of a cell are pushed over to the side in that little red area, and they store fat. They have one job, and they do it to the best of their abilities. So back to this idea of producing stress hormones and inflammatory messages. I asked, so are these fat cells, these adipose cells, part of the endocrine system because of releasing stress hormones? Or are they part of the immune system because they release inflammatory messages? It's kind of a trick question because the answer is both. They're now being thought of as related to the endocrine system and the immune. So what do these fat cells in the midsection remind us of? Well, think back to the title of this topic, this presentation, Muffin Tops and Sugar Bellies. So here are some examples of people that have chronic inflammation. So how is inflammation related to obesity? Well, inflammation and obesity are tied together in a vicious cycle. Turns out that increased inflammation increases weight gain, and then increased weight gain increases inflammation, and around it goes. In fact, now obesity has been speculated to take 9 years off the life expectancy of the average American baby born today. So can we reduce chronic inflammation? Yes, the treatment for inflammation is on our plate and in our shoes. Another quote from the book, if we don't eat high quality, nutrient dense foods, we will become inflamed and fat. So I ask you, is it possible that bodies that look like this, muffin tops and sugar bellies, actually represent people who are malnourished? This is a newer idea. 15, 20 years ago, I would have been laughed out of the room if I suggested that an obese person could be obese and malnourished at the same time. But that's really what we're now coming to understand. So how can we reduce chronic inflammation? The answer is make some changes in our food choices, our lifestyle, and our physical activities. So step 1, let's stop eating those foods that are causing the chronic inflammation. Another quote, processed refined carbs slow down metabolism and contribute to aging, diabetes, heart disease, dementia, and cancer. Here's an example of some research. Calories from a fast food meal were shown to create more inflammation in the participants' bodies than the same amount of calories provided from fruits and vegetables. So if they had the same amount of calories, where did the inflammation come from? It had to come from something that was a component of the fast food meal, right? Another example of some research. A long-term study of 210,000 U.S. adults. Those with the most inflammatory diets had a 46% increased risk for heart disease and 28% increased risk for stroke compared to those with the anti-inflammatory eating style. So about 70% of our U.S. packaged foods and beverages are considered ultra-processed foods. And these ultra-processed foods are contributing over half of the calories that the typical American reports eating. Ultra-processed foods are in the news. Here's just a couple examples of some headlines. This says, fast carbs, are they hijacking our health? Why we overeat? Hint, it's not apples and cabbage. And then this one, are ultra-processed foods making us fat? Now take a look at this guy. His name is Kevin Hall, and he's a very brave man. He's doing research on ultra-processed foods. Now, can you think of any industry that would not be happy about having someone research ultra-processed foods? Yeah, pretty much all the entire food industry and beverage industry is certainly not happy about this. He has some protection because he does work in a government office, but other researchers who have tried to take on this topic of demonstrating that ultra-processed foods are not good for us, those folks have had their offices ransacked and they've had threats made to them. So ultra-processed foods in the news. Here he is, Kevin Hall and his research team at the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases. That team is studying the role of ultra-processed foods in the U.S. obesity epidemic. Again, very brave man. So the research question sounds kind of simple. Will people eat more calories when eating a diet composed of ultra-processed foods versus unprocessed foods, meaning whole foods, healthy foods? If we hold the same amount of sugar, carbs, fat, and salt, if we hold those equal. So it's actually more difficult than we might originally think, because how are you going to provide ultra-processed foods and unprocessed foods, but somehow have the sugar and carbs and fat and salt all be the same? So it was pretty tricky. So the question, are ultra-processed foods making us fat? So the way they went about this is 20 people lived at the facility for a month and were provided twice as much food as they needed and were told to eat as much or as little as they wanted. It was in the form of 3 meals plus snacks and bottled water. They measured every bite that each participant ate. And like I said, they controlled it for carbs and sugar and fat and protein and fiber. So all these nutrients were equal in the two different groups of diets. And each group did 2 weeks on each diet. So are ultra-processed foods making us fat? The results were shocking. Participants ate an average of 500 more calories per day when they were eating the ultra-processed foods versus the unprocessed foods. And again, shockingly, the ultra-processed group gained 2 pounds in 2 weeks, but the unprocessed group lost 2 pounds in 2 weeks. Really, really powerful results that came out of this. And remember, both diets had equal amounts of sugar and carbs and fat, those things that are being blamed for the obesity epidemic. So it has to be something else about the ultra-processed foods. Here's another example of someone who's trying to get our attention with this idea of our food choices and what's in our food. His book is called Salt, Sugar, and Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. So here's some key points and some summary statements from that book. Currently, 300 processed food manufacturers, so factories, are producing 60,000 different types of processed food items that show up in our typical supermarkets. Salt, sugar, and fat are the pillars of ultra-processed foods. They have been shown to light up the same spot in the brain that cocaine does. So different combinations of sugar, salt, and fat. The bliss point of sugar is defined as a measure of maximum taste satisfaction, which causes consumers to crave sugar in an addictive manner. And the leading executives in the processed food industry avoid eating the products that are made by their own companies. So this really gets our attention, I hope, because foods are being engineered intentionally to make us get addicted to them. They're not really even foods. They don't exist in nature. They're man-made, engineered items. So again, under step 1, stop eating the foods that cause chronic inflammation. Another quote from the book: shifting from refined carbs to healthier carbs, which I remind you is vegetables, legumes, whole grains, whole fruit, would lead to a dramatic reduction in obesity and all diseases of aging. Pretty strong statement. However, the food industry spends over $30 billion per year to convince us to buy ultra-processed refined carbs. Cookies, chips, donuts, pastries, snack cakes, fast food, soda, candy. It's a lot of money. So step 2, let's choose foods that reduce chronic inflammation. Step 1 was stop eating the foods that are causing the inflammation. And step 2 is let's have some healing foods that actually help us reduce inflammation. So what are those nutrient-dense whole foods? Well, things like whole fruits, fresh and frozen vegetables, higher fiber whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, beans, olive oil, tea, garlic, herbs and spices, chicken, turkey, eggs, fish, seafood, lower fat dairy products or those non-dairy alternatives, smaller amounts of lean beef and pork, dark chocolate, red wine in moderation or none at all. So I hope that description reminded you of a very popular eating style called the Mediterranean diet. It keeps winning all the awards for healthiest way to eat for all of our chronic diseases. And you may also have heard of the DASH diet, which is a well-researched, long-running clinical trial that started out looking at dietary approaches to stop hypertension. And then more recently, the MIND diet is a combination of DASH and Mediterranean, and it is looking at ways to support brain health. So all three of these are really converging on the same concepts, which is what we just talked about, those foods that we just listed, those nutrient-dense foods. So again, continuing to choose foods that reduce inflammation, we can ask ourselves, is this a real food? Is it fresh? Is it as close as possible to its natural state? Is this a real food? Would my great-grandmother recognize this as food? Think about that. What would great-grandma do if she walked into one of our modern grocery stores? Did this food ever have a root or a mother? And let's eat in harmony with our genes so we can fit into our genes. So in review, why is that basic inflammation process important? I think we now understand that we need it to be able to protect ourselves from infections and foreign substances and not have to live in a bubble our whole lives. But what is chronic inflammation? Chronic inflammation is when it goes on too long and the alarm is continually sounding when it's not meant to be set up to be a chronic situation. And so then that's where the problems start occurring with creating the obesity and then the chronic diseases that all appear to be related to this idea of chronic inflammation. The 2 steps to reduce chronic inflammation: step 1, stop eating those foods that are causing the chronic inflammation, and step 2, choose foods that reduce it. So I hope that you heard something today that's helpful and interesting. I can be reached at this email, sharon.peterson@thevillageshealth.com. I also use the portal if you are a patient of the Villages Health. I hope you enjoyed today's topic, and I hope to hear from you soon.